provocative question. Have you ever wondered how a single person, a lone outlaw, could destroy an entire police unit, leaving behind a trail of chaos and fear that would echo for years? What drives a man to stand against the full force of law enforcement, knowing they are outnumbered and outgunned, yet still emerge victorious? Opening with a strong hook, the Brazilian Badlands, 1930s, deep in the desolate heart of this Sertão, a land ravaged by drought and lawlessness, one name carried a weight that struck terror into the hearts of both the police and the local population. That name was Corisco, infamous outlaw and one of the most feared figures in the Cangaço movement. But what Corisco did to a police unit sent after him wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a message, a terrifying display of power and defiance that shocked an entire region. The buildup of tension. Imagine a time when law enforcement was seen not as a beacon of justice, but as mere pawns in a brutal game of survival. The police, who had been hunting Corisco for years, thought they had finally cornered him. They were wrong. In the rugged terrain of the Sertão, where the sun burned unforgivingly and every man was hardened by a life of struggle, Corisco didn't just flee or hide. No, he turned the tables, making the very police force hunting him regret ever coming after him. The man they thought they had trapped would leave them shattered, their confidence broken. But Corisco didn't just escape. He didn't merely vanish into the wilderness as they had hoped. What Corisco did that day was far worse. He destroyed the police unit, not just physically, but mentally. With an uncanny understanding of his terrain and his enemies, he orchestrated a stunning attack that left the police officers reeling, unable to comprehend how they had been outsmarted and overwhelmed. They had come to capture him but left as mere survivors of an encounter they could never have predicted. Emotional beat. Imagine the fear that gripped these officers as they realized they had been completely outmatched. The terror that took root as they understood that no amount of training, no amount of backup, could save them from this one outlaw, this force of nature. Their mission had become their undoing. They had gone into the Badlands as hunters but left as prey. Corisco's victory over them wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a humiliating defeat for the lawmen who thought they had control of the situation. Building the tension. In the backwoods of Brazil, amidst the unforgiving landscape of the Sertão, a group of outlaws began to raise a force that would grow in power, fear, and infamy. These men weren't just criminals, they were rebels, survivors, and, most importantly, a symbol of defiance against the state. The Cangaço was born out of chaos, injustice, and desperation. But what made these men so dangerous wasn't just their ability to fight, it was their unyielding refusal to bend to the forces that sought to crush them. While the police thought they had a handle on the bandits, what they failed to see was the rise of a movement. These weren't just isolated criminals. These were warriors bound by a code, by an ideology that extended beyond personal gain. The Cangaço wasn't born from simple theft, or greed. Was a direct response to the failures of the system, to the abuses of power that pushed these men to the brink. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting to carve their place in a world that had left them no other choice. Emotional beat. The rise of the Cangaço was more than a rebellion, was a reclaiming of identity. For those living in the Sertão, where the state had abandoned them, the Cangaço represented a return to power, a way to fight back against an unjust world. But this wasn't a fight for freedom in the traditional sense. No, it was a struggle for recognition, for respect, and most terrifyingly, for the right to impose their own rules. Ending this brutal land. Those who followed the Cangaço found themselves in a world where the law of the land was written by blood, easing action as the movement grew. So did its notoriety. Led by ruthless bandits like Lampião, the Cangaço began to carve its name into the history of Brazil. What started as a few small groups of rebels soon transformed into an organized force, one that could strike fear into the hearts of those who sought to bring them down. These men were not just outlaws, they were legends in the making, each raid, each ambush, each escape adding to their mythos. And the police, unable to fully understand what they were dealing with, found themselves caught in a game they could not win, building the tension. When you think of the Cangaço, one name rises above all others. His very mention sent shivers down the spine of both the poor and the powerful. He wasn't just a bandit, he was a king in a land that had no crown. But how did a poor, uneducated man become the feared leader of an outlaw army? How did a figure who grew up in the dust and desolation of the Sertão become the face of rebellion, revered by his followers and loathed by his enemies? Lampião's rise to power wasn't born of random acts of violence, it was a carefully orchestrated ascent. He didn't start as a natural-born leader, but his sense of survival, his ruthlessness, and his ability to manipulate those around him turned him into the undisputed leader of the Cangaço. What many didn't realize was that Lampião's real power didn't come from his gun or his reputation, it came from his mind. He was a master strategist, a man who could read the land, the people, and his enemies like a map. And that made him an unstoppable force. Emotional beat, his rise was on T without its price. Lampião lost family, friends, and countless comrades along the way, but through each loss, he only grew more determined, more dangerous. His leadership was built on the backs of those who had no other choice but to follow him. They were men and women whose lives had been shaped by violence, injustice, and oppression. But in Lampião, they saw a chance to fight back, to live on their own terms. He became more than a leader, he became a symbol of defiance, a man who had taken the system that oppressed him and turned it into a weapon. His action under Lampião's leadership, the Cangaço became more organized, more strategic, and more feared. Lampião understood something that many of his enemies didn't. The war they were fighting wasn't just physical, it was psychological. He knew how to strike fear into the hearts of those who pursued him, using ambushes, raids, and even misinformation to outmaneuver the police forces. His band wasn't just a group of criminals. It was a well-oiled machine that could survive in a land where the odds were always stacked against them. Building the tension. The story of the Cangaço is often told through the lens of powerful men figures like Lampião, who led with fear and strength. But what about the women who stood beside them, facing the same dangers, fighting with the same ferocity? Among them, one name stands out: Maria Bonita. The myth surrounding her isn't just about her beauty or her love for Lampião, it's about her courage, her resilience, and her role in a world dominated by men. But what did it truly mean for Maria Bonita to be a woman in the Cangaço? Maria Bonita was no mere follower of Lampião's cause. She was a force in her own right. In a time when women were expected to stay in the shadows, Maria Bonita stepped forward, challenging every expectation placed on her. She didn't just fight beside her husband, she fought as an equal. Her presence in the Cangaço wasn't just symbolic, it was essential. Maria Bonita was as much a part of the Cangaço's success as any man, and her story speaks to the unyielding strength of women in the face of oppression and violence. Emotional beat. But the Cangaço was not a place for the faint-hearted, and Maria Bonita faced unimaginable challenges. She didn't just endure the violence of the Cangaço, she lived it, fully aware of the risks and sacrifices involved. She had lost everything: her family, her home, just as Lampião had, but in joining him, she found a new purpose, one that wasn't defined by the norms of society. She was a woman who made her own choices, who carved her own path, and who became a symbol of defiance in a world that saw women as little more than bystanders. His action, the bond between Maria Bonita and Lampião, was more than just a partnership, it was a mutual respect and understanding of the brutal world they lived in. Together, they formed a legendary team, a duo that challenged the very fabric of Brazilian society. But their relationship wasn't without its struggles. In the Cangaço, loyalty was everything, but so was survival. Maria Bonita had to navigate a world where betrayal could come from anyone, even those closest to her. Building the tension in the harsh expanse of the Sertão, where survival was the ultimate goal. Every move had to be calculated. The Cangaço wasn't just about brute force, it was about cunning, strategy, and adapting to the unforgiving landscape. How did a group of outlaws survive against the full might of the Brazilian police and the forces of law and order? What made the Cangaço so effective in the face of overwhelming odds? The key to their success lay in their tactics. These weren't mere bandits, they were guerrilla fighters who understood the land and the minds of their enemies. They knew how to strike fast, how to disappear without a trace, and how to turn the terrain itself into an ally. The Cangaço was a movement born out of necessity, but it was also one shaped by intelligence and adaptation. The outlaws didn't fight in the traditional sense. They fought to win by outsmarting their opponents, creating fear and exploiting every weakness. Emotional beat. The lives of the cangaceiros were marked by a constant state of alertness. They were always on the move, always evading capture, always looking over their shoulders. Their survival depended not just on their weapons, but on their ability to predict and manipulate the actions of the police and other enemies. Each encounter was a chess game, where the stakes were life and death. And in this high-stakes world, the Cangaço thrived, exploiting the very tactics that the police failed to understand. Easing action, the tactics of the Cangaço were varied and ruthless. They used ambushes, sudden raids, and carefully planned disappearances to throw their enemies off balance. They had no fixed bases, no easy targets. Their hideouts were hidden in the vast, desolate terrain where the police couldn't follow, and when they did engage, they didn't do it in conventional battles. The cangaceiros fought like shadows, fast, lethal, and nearly impossible to pin down. But the Cangaço's true strength came from its adaptability. They could blend in with the local population, disappearing into the very communities they terrorized. The outlaws had a network of informants, locals who would provide them with food, shelter, and information. In return, the cangaceiros often offered protection or simply allowed the villagers to live in peace as long as they kept quiet. It was a ruthless exchange, survival at any cost. Building the tension in a world dominated by violence and survival, where every day was a battle, the cangaceiro didn't just rely on weapons and strategy. They drew strength from something deeper, something invisible but incredibly powerful. The Cangaço wasn't just a movement, it was a belief system. A world shaped by rituals, superstitions, and the kind of faith that could make even the most hardened outlaw pause and reflect. But what was the role of religion, ritual, and mysticism in the lives of these brutal men and women? The cangaceiros weren't just fighting for land or power. They were fighting for something they believed was their destiny. The mysticism of the Sertão, a region steeped in folklore, played a significant role in shaping the identity of the outlaws. They believed in the power of spirits, omens, and divine protection. Many cangaceiros carried amulets, charms, and religious symbols to protect themselves in battle. Some believed they were invincible, blessed by higher forces that would ensure their survival. Emotional beat. This mysticism wasn't just superstition, it was a coping mechanism. In a world where death was an everyday reality, where betrayal and violence were constants, the belief in a higher power, in something beyond the tangible, provided solace. The cangaceiros weren't just hardened criminals, they were men and women trying to make sense of a world that seemed designed to destroy them. Their rituals and beliefs gave them a sense of purpose and control in an otherwise chaotic existence. Easing action. Every raid, every battle was preceded by rituals, prayers, songs, and sacred rites that reinforced the cangaceiros' belief in their invincibility. Some would pray to the Padimsico, a popular saint in the region, while others invoked the protection of the Santa Morte, the saint of death. The spiritual rituals weren't just acts of devotion, they were expressions of defiance. To the cangaceiros, their faith gave them the courage to face overwhelming odds and fight a seemingly unbeatable enemy. It was a weapon just as powerful as their guns and knives. But this faith also had a dark side. Some of the cangaceiros believed that violence and death were a form of divine justice, that the suffering they caused was a necessary part of the world's cosmic balance. For them, every life taken wasn't just a victory, it was an offering, a sacrifice to the higher powers they worshipped. In this way, the Cangaço became a movement that blended violence with spiritual warfare, creating a deadly cocktail of belief and brutality. Building the tension. In the harsh world of the Cangaço, violence wasn't just a tool, it was a language. Every battle, every raid, every act of defiance was steeped in brutality. But what truly set the cangaceiros apart wasn't just their ability to fight, it was their willingness to impose their own code of justice, a code that was terrifying in its severity. The punishments they administered, both to their enemies and to their own, were beyond anything most could fathom. What drove them to commit such extreme acts? The Cangaço wasn't just about killing, it was about making a statement. The cangaceiros had a brutal system of punishment that went beyond mere execution. For them, punishment was a form of spectacle, a way to send a clear message to both their enemies and their own men. If someone disrespected the code, betrayed the group, or failed in their duties, they faced not just death, but a death that was designed to terrify. Emotional beat. This wasn't just physical torture, it was psychological warfare. The fear of punishment was ever present, and the threat of a violent end kept the cangaceiros in line. Betrayal within the ranks was a cardinal sin, and the consequences were often public and horrifying. The punishments were intended to break the spirit, to send a message that no one was beyond the reach of the group's brutal justice. But this form of violence wasn't just for show, it was a survival mechanism, a way to maintain control in a world where loyalty was the only thing that mattered. Easing action, the punishments administered by the cangaceiros were not quick or merciful. They were meant to instill fear, to remind everyone that loyalty was paramount. Those who violated the code were subjected to cruel, slow deaths. Some were hung in public as a reminder of what would happen to anyone who defied the Cangaço. Others were mutilated, left as warnings for anyone who might think twice about crossing the line. These weren't just acts of revenge, they were calculated, strategic moves designed to maintain control and dominance over the region. But what's truly chilling is that these punishments were not just reserved for outsiders. The cangaceiros believed in maintaining order within their own ranks, and anyone who stepped out of line, whether out of fear, cowardice, or betrayal, could face the same horrifying fates as their enemies. This created an atmosphere of constant tension where trust was everything, and the smallest infraction could result in the most brutal punishment. Building the tension, the Cangaço didn't just leave a legacy of fear and bloodshed, it left behind a trail of unanswered questions. One of the most haunting aspects of this outlaw movement is the mystery surrounding its eventual downfall. How did such a formidable force, one that had terrorized the Brazilian Badlands for so long, simply fade into history? What was the true cause behind the end of the Cangaço? Was it the overwhelming pressure from the police forces, or something deeper, something that the cangaceiros themselves couldn't escape? The end of the Cangaço wasn't a singular event. It was a slow, agonizing decline, marked by betrayals, misunderstandings, and the natural passage of time. But the true story of how the cangaceiros were finally defeated is far more complex than the simple narrative of a police victory. It was not just the guns of the police that took them down, it was the unraveling of the very fabric that had held the movement together. The Cangaço's ultimate defeat is as much about the internal fractures within the group as it is about external forces closing in on them. Emotional beat. The cangaceiros had fought for so long against insurmountable odds. They had lived and died by a code that had sustained them for years. But in the end, it wasn't just the relentless pursuit of the police that broke him, it was the human element. Betrayal, paranoia, and exhaustion set in, tearing the once unified group. Apartamento. The myth of the cangaceiros, built on loyalty and brotherhood, began to crumble as individuals turned on one another. This betrayal wasn't just from outside, it came from within. Easing action, the mysterious death of Lampião, along with the capture and death of his closest allies, marked the final chapter of the Cangaço. But the question remains, was this truly the end? The police may have silenced the leaders, but the legend of the cangaceiros never truly died. In the hearts of those who had followed them, the spirit of resistance and defiance lived on. The end of the Cangaço didn't mark the death of its influence, it only changed its form, transforming from an armed rebellion into a cultural myth. But there are still unanswered questions. Many of the circumstances surrounding the deaths of the cangaceiros are shrouded in mystery. Was Lampião betrayed by someone close to him, or was he simply outgunned and outnumbered? Why did the cangaço, which had once been a symbol of resistance, fall apart so quickly? These questions, like the ghosts of the cangaceiros themselves, continue to haunt the Sertão, building the tension. The cangaço was not just a violent chapter in Brazilian history, it was a story of resistance, survival, and rebellion. But how does history remember these outlaws? Were they simply criminals? Or did they become something more? As the years passed, the memory of the cangaço transformed, evolving into a cultural legend that is still alive in the Brazilian imagination today. How did the cangaceiros go from being feared bandits to symbols of defiance in the eyes of the people? The truth is, the legacy of the cangaço is a complex one. To some, the cangaceiros were romanticized as heroes, fighters for the oppressed who dared to challenge the system that had abandoned the poor. They became legends, figures of folklore that captured the imagination of the Brazilian people. Their story, filled with daring raids and escapes, took on a mythical quality, transcending their violent actions and transforming them into symbols of resistance against an unjust system. Emotional beat. But not everyone saw them this way. To the authorities, the cangaceiros were nothing more than dangerous criminals who terrorized the survivors. Their actions were a direct challenge to law and order, and their presence was a constant reminder of the state's inability to control its own borders. For the government and the military, the cangaço was a problem to be solved, and its leaders were enemies to be eliminated. The way history has treated the cangaceiros depends largely on who you ask. Some saw them as freedom fighters, others as ruthless criminals, easing action over time. However, the cangaço's influence grew, and their story became more than just a footnote in history. The cangaceiros were celebrated in songs, literature, and films, each retelling adding new layers to their mythos. Lampião, Maria Bonita, and Corisco became figures whose stories were passed down through generations. The cultural impact of the cangaço is still felt today, with countless documentaries, books, and even festivals celebrating their lives and deeds. Building the tension, the cangaço may have ended with the deaths of its leaders and the collapse of its organized bands, but its legacy continues to shape the Brazilian mindset. The myth of the cangaceiros is woven into the fabric of Brazil's cultural identity, influencing everything from literature to cinema and even political movements. But what is it about this outlaw movement that still resonates with people today? Why does the story of these violent rebels still captivate our imaginations decades after their downfall? The cangaço wasn't just a historical event. It was a reflection of the social, economic, and political inequalities that plagued the Brazilian Badlands. The cangaceiros became the voice of the disenfranchised, the downtrodden who had nothing left to lose. And even though their actions were marked by violence, their defiance against a corrupt system made them symbols of resistance to many. This paradox, the tension between their violent methods and their status as freedom fighters, makes the legacy of the cangaço so complex. Emotional beat. The spirit of the cangaceiros lives on in the hearts of many Brazilians, especially those from rural areas who still see them as icons of defiance against the powerful. But the true lesson of the cangaço is not just about the violence they committed, it's about the enduring fight for justice, the search for dignity in a world that constantly tries to crush those at the bottom. The cangaceiros may have been outlaws, but they were also, in their own way, freedom fighters. Their actions extreme as they were highlight the lengths to which people will go when they are pushed to the edge. Rising action. Today, the cangaço continues to inspire a wide range of cultural expressions, from books and films to music and art. The story of the cangaceiros has been retold, reshaped, and reimagined, always keeping their rebellious spirit alive. And yet, the true legacy of the cangaço lies in the question it forces us to confront. What does it mean to fight for survival in a world that has no place for you? In the end, the cangaço teaches us that the struggle for justice is never easy, and that those who dare to fight back are often remembered long after their time has passed. If you've followed the story of the Cangaço to its bitter end. You know that the fight for justice is never simple. Do you think the cangaceiros were misunderstood, or were they simply criminals in the eyes of history? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. What do you think their true legacy is? Don't forget to leave a like if you found this story captivating. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one. There's another video here that continues to explore the untold stories of resistance. Click and join me there. But the question remains, was the Cangaço truly a movement of resistance, or were these men and women simply opportunists driven by a thirst for power? The truth lies somewhere in between. The cangaceiros weren't just one thing, they were a reflection of the struggles of the people they came from. In the end, their legacy is as much about the contradictions within their movement as it is about their actions.